about a minute until we get everybody in the door and virtually settled, if you will, before we get started. So thank you for being with us, and we'll be right back with you. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm Paul Reville, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of our Crackerjack team at the Education Redesign Lab, who, before I say anything else, I want to thank for putting together this amazing set of events that are going to amount to our virtual convening now. We know that we're welcoming in our By All Means teams from all over the country. And we are painfully mindful of the circumstances that are going on in all of our communities around the country, where we've got a surge in cases in the pandemic. And this is an especially challenging time for children, for families, for school systems. And we know you're all in the midst of coping with that on a personal level, on a professional level, on a community level, and that the work you're doing is centrally important to being successful in this. And we hope that the offerings that we're going to be able to provide over the next few days are informative and inspiring and helpful to you in not just coping, but succeeding in addressing both the immediate challenges and some of the long-term challenges that we were all organized in the first place to address. We're all working for the same goal, which is better opportunities, better supports, better outcomes and results, more success for all of our children, and all means all. So that's the mission that brings us together, that brings us to the table. We're so proud of the work that you're doing, and we're very eager to hear from you in terms of how it's going, to learn from you, to help share some resources with you, and to move ahead together. So just a few quick slides. This is what we have coming. This is our opening session, and we'll say more about our featured speaker in a few moments. Our dean will be joining us shortly to introduce this. A few tech tips you see in front of you on the screen now. If you have any questions, please use the chat box and any of the technical aspects, and we'll provide you support on that as best we can during the course of the session. And we especially want to thank our supporters, folks who've been with us, some for the long haul of this work, some more recently. We're deeply grateful to all of you who've made possible this convening today: the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Oak Foundation, the Linda Hammett Ori and Andrew Ori Charitable Trust, the Schwartz Family Foundation, the Shaw Family Foundation. You've all been very generous with us and made possible not only this convening, but more generally, the work that we do. I'm going to say a few things about our current predicament and really about how we at the lab have been thinking about this moment and where we're headed. Before I get started with those slides, I'll emphasize just 2 points. We've really been celebrating, focusing, and spotlighting your work in children's cabinets and local communities. We've accumulated so much evidence based on your work that these mechanisms have been critically important mechanisms for convening, for communication, for collaboration, and for connectivity between schools and families and other organizations within the community that serve the needs of children and child development. And that work on children's cabinets has been widely picked up by a number of sources throughout the country. And Telegraph Aspen Institute, for example, made it one of its chief points of advice to the nation's governors is growing and expanding and increasing support for children's cabinets. So that's one point we're emphasizing. And a second point, which I'll come to in my other remarks, which is just the need for personalization. We've always felt, as you know, that one of the main flaws of our education system is that it's a factory model. It's a one-size-fits-all model, batch processing, mass production of education, and that we need to shift to an individualized, customized, personalized paradigm in education. Well, we think this is the moment when that can happen, when that needs to happen, because if one size fits all didn't work very well before the pandemic, it works even less well after the pandemic when we socially promoted whole classes of students, whole cohorts of students. And the gaps that we ordinarily have at the beginning of any school year are even larger than they typically are. And it breaks down our notion that we can simply teach to the middle and everything will work out. It won't work here. And if it doesn't work well for students, we found it works even less well for families. And families are so critically important in this moment, and including them in the educational equation, putting them in the central place that our rhetoric has always granted to them, but our actions have never really supported that in the education sector. Suddenly families are at the center, and their circumstances are so widely variable in this nation with such widespread inequality and differential access to opportunity and support. So we need to take into account families and families' needs, and we need to differentiate, meet people where they are, both families and children, and give them what they need, both inside and outside of school, both inside and outside of the remote platform, to help people move forward. So we've been touting the success planning work that you've been doing, and the notion of a navigator for every child and every family that sticks with that family, gets to know the child and know the family and know what they need and how to get it for them, and moves through the education system with them, simultaneously with them as an advocate. So these are two topics, the children's cabinets and the individual success planning, that are an important outgrowth of your work that we've been working hard to promote nationally. So let me go then to my first slide, if we can get that up on the screen. This is a particularly compelling quote that I've encountered in recent weeks from Arundhati Roy. And it says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I just felt this was a particularly apt sort of summation of the kind of work that all of you were doing anyway, but now becomes so essentially important in how we cope with the immediacy of this tragedy, and then in how we look to the future. Next slide, please. What we've just endured, what we've just been through, is the equivalent really of an ongoing earthquake with aftershocks like the one we're experiencing now, with the recurrent surges in the pandemic and its effect on people. And we're only in the early stages, I would argue, of coming out from under the rubble and figuring out how to rescue fellow citizens, how to establish normal patterns that allow for us to meet the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and at the same time to communicate with one another, to begin to even contemplate rebuilding systems that bear some resemblance of normalcy, even if our ultimate goal, as it should not be, is to restore the status quo ante. We're not aiming to go back to where we were, but at the same time, there's certain basic systems that need to be there. And we and our colleagues, particularly colleagues working on the front line in this pandemic, are just struggling to come out from under the aftershocks of this earthquake. Next slide, please. I've likened it in some quarters to a tidal wave. Tidal waves frequently follow earthquakes, and this tidal wave has lifted up the ocean to reveal on the ocean floor the lives of folks that many of our fellow citizens weren't aware of, and inequities that they weren't aware of. Inequities in areas like health and mental health and food, access to food, and housing. You'll remember when the school closures first happened, there was a lot of public attention, and it was on the front page of many of our national newspapers and news broadcasts that where were children going to eat now? How were they going to get health care and mental health? There was an assumption, a broad-based assumption that they were getting all of these things in school. Well, we know that sometimes they were getting some of these things in school, that we do have school lunch programs and breakfast programs. We do have clinics that provide some support to some of the students some of the time. But the lived experience of people on that ocean floor, which has been going on for generations, suddenly revealed to the general public and creating something of a sense of urgency about building that cradle to career pipeline to which we've dedicated our work in the By All Means initiative. And that creates a moment, and I think a moment of opportunity. Next slide, please. Well, this is an often talked about Chinese character, or Chinese word for crisis, which is really composed of two characters, danger, and we have ample evidence every day we wake up of the danger that we're in. There are health dangers, there are economic dangers, there are dangers in terms of justice in this country. The danger is readily apparent at the personal level, at the community level, at the national level. And yet in the midst of all that danger, there are also opportunities. There are opportunities for us to bring about shifts and changes that might not have been possible under ordinary circumstances, but because we've had this crisis, it's propelled us into embracing the discomfort of change, whether we wanted to or not, because it was the only way to cope. Think, for example, about our embrace of technology. We live and work in a sector that by and large has been reluctant to embrace the tools of technology to advance teaching and learning, to say nothing of administration and oversight of our sector. As a result of schools closing almost uniformly in March, we were catapulted literally overnight into the world of educational technology, whether we were ready or not. And most of us weren't really ready, as opposed to other industries like business or medicine. And we've done the best we can to adapt and adjust and to move from emergency response to state-of-the-art response in online learning, but we're not there yet. We have a long way to go. But the point here is we've made a shift. Just as I described, we made a shift with respect to the way in which we regard and work with families. There's now much more connectivity between schools and families, for example, than there had been in the past, because there has to be, it's essential. The emphasis on building relationships. I think all of us have found this in our teaching, but we find it in the extraordinary efforts that many of our school districts are taking to reach out personally to students and establish relationships, because relationships have been so deeply fractured in this time. The notion of personalization, the notion that now we have no choice but to find them where they are and give them what they need, to actually see each student for their particular assets and to know their challenges and to be in a position to support them. All these kinds of paradigmatic changes, which we can't really, while we're still traumatized in the earthquake, institute in a systematic transformational way going forward. But we can begin to envision these changes, and we can begin to take advantage of this opportunity to establish new ways of doing business as we move forward. Next slide, please. In the midst of all of it, I want to emphasize a point I've already made, but just to underline it, which is the importance of relationships and nurturance. I think for too long, we've envisioned what we do in school systems as kind of an offshoot of the 3 R's, that we're really transferring knowledge and building skill. And to be sure, those are very important central functions of what we do in the world of education. But at the same time, we can't do that. A prerequisite is the nurturance, the giving birth to, the raising up, the child development aspect of the work, which is, after all, what our cradle to career pipeline commitment is all about. It's not just what happens in school for the 20% of students' waking hours when they're in school, actually, but it's what happens in the entire 360-degree surround of their lives, 365 days a year. And in that environment, we have got to have the nurturance, the child raising, the child development, the giving birth to the relationships that make education possible. So it's not just a technical transfer of knowledge and skill, but it's a nurturance of a learner, and it's the growing of the capacity for success in each and every child. And one of my deepest hopes is that we use this moment in order to bring about that change and to move more in that direction, as we think not only of sort of restructuring our schools to emphasize and to structure in and incentivize the building of relationships, as we move toward personalization, as we increase our use of technology, as we think more holistically about the lives of children, as we emphasize topics like early childhood and after school and summer learning and all the things that so many of you are working on in the field. This is a moment for us. Next slide, please. Final slide. Most of you aren't old enough to remember the launch of the SPUTNIK, but the SPUTNIK was a critical moment in the shaping and structure and governance of American public education. For a long time, education had been left to states and localities to deal with. And in the late 50s, when the Soviet Union launched a satellite, first one in space, much to the surprise of the American public, the American government, and the scientific community, we began to get worried. We felt we were at risk as a nation because we weren't up to speed in technology at the level that we thought we were. We thought we were superior to the rest of the world, and suddenly the Soviet Union surged by us. So that triggered a massive reconsideration of the federal role in education and the equivalent of a federal Marshall Plan, whether it was in the War on Poverty or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act or the National Defense Education Act. Federal government decided big time it was in our national interest to bring about significant changes in public education. Now, reasonable people can argue about whether those changes were successful or not over time, but I think we're also in a similar moment now where we have the opportunity as a nation, still very much at risk, not just from this pandemic, but from our underperformance in developing human capital. We have this moment, not just at the federal level, but at the state level, at the local level, at the community level, in the confines of organizations that you're running like children's cabinets, to re-envision what we're doing with our young people and where we're headed, and to begin to pivot in directions that make it possible for a much more significant percentage of our young people to be successful, to really lean into the notion of all means all, no child left behind, every student succeeds. That's the essential nature of the work, but it's going to take a much more potent, much more robust effort to do that. And I believe that in the work that you're doing in the By All Means community, you're showing us the way. And we want to build on that work and support you in making that work more effective as we go ahead. So that, I think, is the mission. That's the challenge that's in front of us. That's what brings all of us to the table. I'm hopeful, if at the same time, still feeling, as so many of you are, the tragedy and the trauma of the current crisis that we're facing. I want to shift gears now and move to introducing our keynote speaker. And in order to do that, we're blessed by the presence of the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Dean Bridget Terry Long, who so ably led our school through these turbulent times, who led the senior faculty in the effort to recruit the distinguished new upcoming faculty member, Susan Dynarski, who you're about to hear from. Bridget, we thank you for your work and leadership. We especially thank you for your support of the Education Redesign Lab and our By All Means initiative. And thank you for joining us today to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Paul. It is wonderful to join all of you this afternoon. Again, my name is Bridget Long, and I'm very proud to be the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I may have had the chance to interact with some of you previously, and I'm glad, even if we can't be together physically, that we can be together virtually. So it is wonderful to be with you during this fall 2020 by all means convening. I am incredibly grateful to Paul and his team in the Education Redesign Lab for bringing us together, particularly with the timely topic of rebuilding for an equitable America. We know that the pandemic has only exacerbated previously existing inequities in our education system, and our best thinking and supports are urgently needed. So I can't think of anyone better suited to speak to you on this topic than Sue Dynarski. Sue has made understanding and reducing inequality in education her life's work. And she's currently a professor of public policy, education, and economics at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the effectiveness of charter schools, the optimal design of financial aid, and the impact of student loans, the relationship between post-secondary schooling and labor market outcomes, and the effect of high school reforms on academic achievement and educational attainment. She's a celebrated scholar, and her work has been at the forefront of understanding the challenges faced by students and families. And she's been a really important voice in critical education debates. So if you haven't had a chance to see some of her writing in the New York Times or her Twitter account, which is definitely one of my faves, how she's bringing to light the issues that we need to fight for in support of low-income students and really all students. And I'm so excited that Sue will be joining us on the faculty next year. I have known Sue for many, many years. And I've been so lucky personally to be on the same side of some battles with her, some policy, let's just say heated policy discussions at times. And she's always been an amazing partner in crime. Even so, we had the opportunity to travel together in China. And I was just so thankful. I have to thank her here publicly. Her family, embraced me. I was there by myself, and her family embraced me as we were traveling through Beijing and meeting with people there. And it was wonderful to get to know that not only is her work top notch and really focused on the important mission, but her heart is good. And it was great to see that side of her. So I'm so pleased to welcome Sue, and we'll turn things over to her. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I am extremely excited to be coming home to Cambridge and to Boston. I grew up in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is one of our groups here. So returning to Somerville, this is before Somerville was a thing, to be clear. I grew up in Somerville around the time that Davis Square was so dead that McDonald's left for the local mall. So I'm coming back to a Somerville quite different from the one that I grew up in. What I'm going to be talking about today is in great part rooted in my own experience growing up in a working class family in Somerville. My dad was a high school dropout. My mom got a few credits of college, but never was able to finish college. So I am a first generation college graduate and very proud of that. And it forms a lot of my research, the questions I ask, and hypotheses that I form come from that experience. What I'm going to talk about today is inequality in education. I'm going to show you some statistics. We haven't, data on what's happening right now largely have not arrived in most places. I'm going to be showing you what we knew before COVID hit and what we think the impact of the pandemic and the Great Recession, another Great Recession that we've got in front of us, are having on education, and then spotlight a few policies that we know reduce inequality in education, and that probably are going to be relevant in this context as well. So let me start out by showing you some stats. So I'm going to start, I started my career focusing on inequality and who goes to college. And this is from a paper I did on that topic. These are data on what share of people go to college eventually, broken up by what their income was when they were growing up. So this is the fraction of college goers, what proportion go to college, 0 to 1. We have 2 birth cohorts. This is roughly mine, though I'm a little younger than this. And then this is the next cohort that we've got these data on. And then we've got it broken up by the income group that the child grew up in. So did the child grow up in the top 25% of the income distribution, or did the child grow up in the lowest 25%? Of the income distribution. So I'm down here. 19% of my neighbors and I went off to college. Now that number is more like 29%. So among the young people who grow up in the 25% poorest households, we still only have a college attendance rate of 29%. Now that's a product of what proportion of those children in that income group even graduate high school, right? So there's a lot of steps on the way to college, and I'll be showing how this inequality unfolds over the life cycle. But this is what it looks like at college entry: 29% for the lowest income, 80% of those in the highest income quartile at this point are going to college. And the growth, much of the growth has taken place in that top income group.
Susan, I'm going to interrupt you briefly. We do not see the slides that you're speaking of, so perhaps
Well,
you can
that's
stop
definitely
sharing.
A problem.
Yeah, perhaps you can stop sharing and reshare your slides, please.
Okay, you gotta interrupt me sooner than that. Feel free to interrupt me. I'll just keep yakking.
Thank you. There we go.
You got it?
Yes, please.
All right. So there is the slide that you were not seeing. Okay, you see it now? Protest if you don't.
We do.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. So blue line, older cohort, red line, younger cohort, people born in the 60s, people born in the 70s to 80s. What share of them go to college? In this, and the height of this thing is about historical increases in how many people go to college. So overall, a jump in college going from, in this bottom income group, 19% were going for the older cohort. Now it's 29%. At the top, it's gone from 58% to 80%. The slope of this line essentially tells us about inequality by income and who goes to college. Okay, so we've got an enormous gap in college going between the lowest income kids, 29%, versus 80% at the top of the income distribution. So even at college entry, we see quite a bit of inequality. If we then look at who graduates, that's when it gets really sharp. So again, I'm down here. 5% of my classmates, peers went on to earn a BA. So I am one of the very, very lucky kids to make it through college. It's only jumped up to 9% at this point. So we still are in a place that, living in many of the cities that we do, we often have the impression that everybody goes to college and everybody graduates college. And aren't there too many people going to college and too many people graduating college? And a good statistic to come back with is if we look at the 25% poorest kids in our country, less than 10% of them are getting a BA, right? So this is not everybody by any means. A lot of talent, a lot of productivity is being left on the table. If you look at where the growth has been in BA completion, it's really coming from the top half of the income distribution. So it went from 36% of those in the top income quartile getting a BA to 54%. And so this inequality has actually risen considerably. You can sort of see these two lines are not in parallel, but the red line is sort of tilting up. Here I'm imposing geometry on you. The red line is tilting up and is steeper. The relationship between getting a BA and childhood advantage has gotten stronger over time. And this is a time when a whole bunch of federal policies were introduced that were intended to make it more likely that low-income students would go to and graduate from college. This is the era when the Pell Grant and student loans were rolling out in particular. What's driving the difference that we just saw between going to college and graduating college is very different rates of college completion. So at the bottom of the income, and this hasn't changed a whole lot over time, at the bottom of the income distribution, about a third of students who start college actually get a BA. A bit more than that go on and get an AA, but it's not, it doesn't change this picture a whole lot. At the top, by contrast, about 2/3 complete their degree. So we have dropout rates that are twice as high at the bottom of the income distribution as at the top of the income distribution. And this pattern of, basically at each step in the educational pipeline that we lose low-income students goes all the way back to kindergarten, right? It goes forward in college and it goes backward all the way to kindergarten. So these are data from Michigan. I've been working with the state of Michigan extensively in trying to understand what inequality looks like in the state and to test policies to try to reduce it. And so these data are information on 9th grade to college attainment for, and FARM is free and reduced meals, right? So these are kids who are eligible for the free and reduced price lunch. And these are those who are not. And so what you see here is we're starting out by looking at all 9th graders in the state. And then if you look at what share of 9th graders show up in 10th grade, show up in 11th grade, show up in 12th grade, graduate high school on time, enroll in college, you can see the lower income students pulling further and further away from their more advantaged peers, right? So, and there's not any point in here where there's some big change. It's just a steady downward drip that we lose low-income students in 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. They're less likely to graduate high school on time. They're less likely to enroll in college. If we look at achievement, so this is from another data set. This is now national data that Sean Reardon has pulled together. And this is now telling us what the gap in achievement is measured by standardized test scores between children from families are at the 90th percentile of the income distribution and those at the 10th percentile. So basically the families at the very top of the income distribution and the bottom of the income distribution. And this is in standardized test score units. So in 1940, for those born in 1940, children born in 1940, you tended to see a gap, an income gap of about 0.6 standard deviations. For those born in 2000, it has gone up. It has nearly doubled to about 1.2 standard deviations. So differences by income in academic achievement in school, as measured by standardized test scores, because that's the best way we can compare this over time, have doubled. If we compare that, here's some good news finally, to the black-white gap by contrast, that actually has dropped by about half. So at the same time that the black-white gap has been dropping substantially, our income gap has been doubling. This obviously then affects the differences in attainment that I just showed you, because a kid who's performing at the bottom of his class is not going to graduate high school and is certainly not going to go on to college. Now, if we focus on those kids who actually do succeed in their academic preparation, end up with high test scores in high school, we still see big gaps by income in who goes to college and who completes college. So what we have now here, this has gotten complicated, but what we have is 4 groups of math scores, lowest math scores, highest math scores, and 3 socioeconomic groups, low to middle. So up here at 74%, those from the highest socioeconomic status families who also have the highest test scores, 74% of them are getting a BA. If we look at the highest test scores for those from low socioeconomic families, just 41% of them are getting a BA. Now this is, so among those who are actually well prepared, we've still got a gap of 31 percentage points. In fact, if you want to look, find the best comparison for the poor kids with the highest test scores, you look at the rich kids with the second lowest set of test scores. They're graduating from college at the same rates. So this is not all about academic preparation. It's about what goes on in college. It's about college funding. And I'll be talking a bit about this as I go on. So what is the relationship between the pandemic and inequality? Well, it's going to make everything worse. I mean, that's just the best way to summarize it. Take all the statistics that I just showed you, and they're going to be intensified because we know that those gaps come from differences in parental resources, differences in parental environments, differences in income, in access to health. Anything you can name, those gaps are large. And insofar as kids are separated from school, which in the best of circumstances helps to equalize circumstances, we're throwing them back to the inequality that they grew up with. So it's going to intensify all of the gaps that we just saw. We know that online learning in particular, unfortunately, increases inequality. The people who tend to do well in online settings are those who are already doing well. So online classes work great for kids who can't get hold of AP courses in their own districts, but taking them online, it helps them. Online classes are terrible for for high school students who have flunked out of algebra and then try to retake it online. It just tends to intensify our gaps. Youngest are harmed most by being shifted online because they just have the least capacity to engage online independently. And I, among others, so what I'm showing over here on the right in this series of slides is a set of articles I've written for the New York Times on these topics. So if you Google these titles, you'll find the longer pieces. This is my way of cheating and getting in more information than I can possibly speak in 30 minutes. What makes the most sense is to stagger school openings to get the youngest kids into school first. So to prioritize the kindergartners through third graders, for example, and last to bring back the high schoolers who are best able to handle the online setting. By that same logic, it makes sense to keep college campuses closed. So college students are the ones most capable of dealing with learning online, and their travel across state lines to centers of learning like Boston increases the spread of the pandemic. So to the best of our ability, unfortunately, it makes the most sense. And I speak as the parent of a college junior who would like very much to be hanging out with his friends. It makes sense to keep colleges online to reduce risks so that the youngest kids can go to school. Unsaid, of course, is that bars should close before schools do, so that we reduce community transmission so that we can keep schools open for those who need it the most. In terms of reducing the gaps that I showed you in who both goes to college and finishes college, we have strong evidence that complexity in the student aid system has led to inequities in who gets hold of aid. So the financial aid system is intended to boost the chances that low-income kids can go to college and complete college. As many of you surely know, in order to get hold of that grant aid, that loan aid, kids need to complete the FAFSA. Kids need to go through a whole gauntlet of application steps in order to get that aid. And research, including important work by Dean Long, has shown that complexity in the system undermines its effectiveness. So doing something as simple as essentially eliminating the application or filling in the application for students can lead to a boost in college going of as much as 8 percentage points. So a simple thing to do is to simplify the way we apply for aid. I and others have proposed that we just use tax data to qualify students for their aid and not have an application at all. Remove that barrier that tends to increase inequality. We need to strengthen our public colleges. So public colleges are where disadvantaged students go to school. You know, private schools loom large in the New York Times and in our national consciousness, but only about 20% of students go to public colleges. And community colleges, by far, are the entryway for disadvantaged students, for first-generation students, for non-white students, for new immigrants. So our public colleges really need our support. To be clear, making tuition free is not enough. We need to fund institutional capacity at these colleges. So if we make these colleges free and students flood in, but we don't increase funding on a per capita basis to these schools, they can't educate students. So I actually wrote this piece in before the pandemic struck, based on our experiences in the last recession and anticipating that a next recession was around the corner. And I unfortunately was quite right, that we needed to get more funding to our public colleges so they'd be able to absorb the flood of students that tend to appear during recessions. You know, during recessions, there's no jobs or few jobs. And so it's a great time to go to college. The cost of college is, in terms of lost earnings, is much lower. We need to fund our colleges so they can actually educate students. This is sort of sounds like an odd one, given all the discussion of test optional right now. So the the SAT and the ACT have been a gatekeeper for our four-year colleges for a long time. They are also another logistical barrier for disadvantaged students. So actually being able to take the SAT or the ACT is a challenge for many low-income students because it's typically not given in school. In Michigan, where my kids are growing up and where I do my policy work, the SAT is given in the schools. This is true in about a dozen states nationwide, that the test is free during school hours. It's actually required because it is basically the high school test for the purposes of ESA and previously for No Child Left Behind. And research has shown that making the SAT free and part of the school process gets more low-income kids to take the test, gets more of them to college, and gets more of them to complete a BA. So insofar as the SAT and ACT are part of the college landscape, and I think it's still going to be once all of this lifts, we need to make access to it as equitable as possible. Yes, there are gaps in test scores by economic advantage, by race, but the biggest gap of all is between somebody who doesn't take the test at all and somebody who does. When we rely on the initiative of parents, teachers, families to get people to the tests, that's when our inequalities are exposed most sharply. And that is my last slide. I'm actually done about 10 minutes quicker than I thought I would be. But I prefer that because it means that I have more time to hear your questions and protests and brickbats, so we can turn to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue. That's a really helpful platform to start on. I think I'm going to raise a few questions and then I'm going to invite my colleagues to use the chat box and provide any questions that you might want to raise, and we'll do our best to bring those questions forward. So you were talking, first of all, in your initial comments, you talked about that interesting, while inequality is rising on the basis of income, the black-white gap seems to have fallen.
Yep.
How do you explain that, or how do you think about that phenomenon?
This has been the subject of a lot of studies. So, we don't know completely, but we actually, it seems like some of this is success of the civil rights era and of desegregation and of proving the quality of schools for everyone. So we know from recent research that desegregation lifted Black performance, educational attainment, and resegregation is increasing that inequality again. But we actually have some successes that we can look to if we want to think about what needs to happen to reduce the income gaps. We succeeded in reducing the racial gap over the course of decades through court cases, through concerted education policy, through concerted social policy.
So does that suggest to you a set of strategies that seem to have been, and you mentioned some of them, instrumental in changing that should be applied on the basis of income rather than relative to race? Or
well, resources matter. A big chunk of what happened was that per pupil spending at schools attended by Black students went up dramatically. Right. So equalizing the resources available in the schools is important. So insofar as we have great differences in the resources available in low-income schools and high-income schools, equalizing those makes a difference. It's also important to use those resources well, of course, hire the best teachers we can, use curricula that have been tested and shown to work for a broad range of students. But you need the resources in the first place in order to access that set of policies.
So then it's thinking about a more progressive, differentiated distribution of resources than the status quo system typically allows.
Yep.
School finance reform, et cetera.
Yes, and we've had progress on that. So this is what we're seeing here is in spite of school finance reforms that have taken place nationwide, it may be time for a new wave of those. Right.
We had another question that relates to the black-white gap, but brings in your remarks about SAT and ACT, and wondering, A, if you find that those tests themselves are racially biased. B, if so, how would what you're proposing treat that in any way, making it more generally available? How would it overcome that bias if you find such a bias to exist?
So what I've shown you, the research I've shown you is what happens. So in Michigan, what happened when we went from having SAT optional to SAT required? We saw a reduction in the size of racial gaps and income gaps and who went to college and who completed college. That's just what the data show. And the same thing has happened in other districts and states nationwide. Now, were the test a different test and it had better properties, perhaps this would be even more true. The SAT and ACT are what are on the ground right now. So I'm an incrementalist. So given where we are right now, what can we do with the world we have to make it better for low-income students? I don't see the SAT and ACT going away. I see a few colleges going test optional. I see a lot of colleges going test optional during the pandemic, but I anticipate we're gonna have some sort of standardized test for students, no matter what, in terms of for college admission. Now, California is going in its own direction. California is as larger than most countries in the world. So California can do its thing. So California is anticipating designing its own test for college admissions. And if that test is given in the high schools for free, fantastic. What would be a disaster, I would say, is if we went back to what it used to be in the 20th century, early 20th century, every college had its own admissions test. And guess who can afford to travel around taking admissions tests at multiple colleges, right? So that would be a disaster for access if we went to a place where there were different tests for every college or in every state. We need some sort of universal test. Make it better replace the SAT. But there will be, in reality, colleges are going to use some sort of standardized test to admit students. And we need to make sure that all students have access to it.
A related question that was raised by one of our participants had to do with, you've outlined some of the closure in the Black-White achievement gap relative to academic achievement, relative to degree attainment. But does that actually translate, in your knowledge, to changes in income?
The evidence we have is that the return, that the payoff to going to college and completing college is actually higher for disadvantaged students, for low-income students, for non-white students than it is for other students. So this is all, I'm an economist. We didn't mention that word, but this is all, everything else being held equal. Now, problem that we have is that everything else is often not held equal. So if a low-income student goes to a well-resourced university or community college, they will benefit more from that than will a high-income student. Unfortunately, we tend to shunt low-income students into schools that don't get much in the way of resources. So all of this is conditional on funding the schools. So colleges are just like K-12 schools. They need to be funded on a per capita basis. Frequently they are not. They just sort of get a lump each year from their state. If enrollment surges, you don't see an immediate surge in the funding that the state provides.
This has been a phenomenon, has it not, over the past 20 or 30 years, where state aid as a proportion of the budgets of public higher education institutions has shrunk.
Indeed, indeed. So that's why tuition prices have gone up.
Right.
In public colleges.
And the tendency to go for out-of-state private payers and things of that nature.
Exactly. Exactly.
Do you think, this is more of a political question than an economic question, but so we have a new administration coming in. This need that you're describing just in this particular bucket is one of dozens of buckets in education that need more funding. Are you hopeful at the level of attention this challenge of state funding of public higher education is getting as we turn a corner into what hopefully is a new era here of funding?
There's been a lot of discussion of strengthening the federal-state partnership in funding colleges. Right, so the federal government has a big footprint in funding students. Right, so the Pell Grant student loans are basically vouchers that go to students that they can take to any college. The support of the federal government for the institutions themselves has traditionally been quite limited. It's been the job of the states to take care of that, and state funding for the institutions has dropped dramatically. And so there are bills on the Hill that would strengthen that partnership, that would say create a match, a federal match of state funding for public institutions. So I do have some confidence that going forward, there's going to be progress here. We just have so many fronts we need to go forward on. It's not clear when it's going to pop up. I do stress, though, that if we can't just pour money into the student aid end of things, right, give students Pell Grants and then wave goodbye and hope things go well. We can't push students into schools, draw students into schools, if we're not then funding those schools. Yeah. So I think an increase in aid has to go with an increase in institutional capacity.
Although part of your critique of the state funding systems was that it didn't adjust on a per capita basis to increases in enrollment. Now, a change in the Pell Grant would allow for that to happen, but what you're arguing is that would be insufficient nonetheless to the expanded needs that exist in that institution by serving more students.
Yeah, I mean, basically the Pell Grant and other aid lets the students pay their bills. The institutional aid lets schools build classrooms and improve their Wi-Fi capacity. and hire faculty, right? So it's the permanent funding that lets institutions plan that the state and federal funding are an important part of.
I thought an interesting part of what you were talking about was that online learning tends to increase inequality, and for the reasons that you described about access to everything from equipment to connectivity to support at home to do it and things of that nature. I wonder what you've seen that's in any way promising where districts have tried to take a differential approach to students and really aimed at mitigating some of those factors. I know, for example, of a program here in Boston that really is came out of a national charter school organization. You may be familiar with it. It's called Duet. And the focus of Duet is to provide online learning to students who are in lower income groups and in groups that would have been less likely to go to college in the first place or complete in the second place, to enroll them in the University of Southern New Hampshire in their program, which is very inexpensive compared to others, but provide sort of tutorial support in place here in Boston to help them, go through the rigors of responding to an online program in ways that have apparently, although I haven't seen all the data, indicated a much higher level of success in completing college and doing so at a far reduced fee than they would have had they gone to a mainstream institution. That's just one example of mitigating some of those challenges. Are you seeing things, strategies like that work and you're hopeful about?
It's early to see the effect of anything during the pandemic. So I'm basing all of these comments on evidence we have on the impact of policies on inequality pre-pandemic. But basically a useful way to think about it in my mind is that policies to improve college going, to improve persistence, need to think in terms of replacing a college educated parent, right? So think of all of you who have college degrees, think of all of the things you do to help your high school student maneuver through the process of applying for college, registering for the SAT, reading their essay, making sure they get their forms in on time. And then once they're in college, supporting them financially, making sure they don't take 5 physics classes in one semester, just sort of the sensible day-to-day advising that somebody who has been to college can give to their kid. Now imagine being without all that. That's everything that we need to replace with differentiated policy. We need not just support kids in their academic learning, but in all of these steps that are involved in migrating through the bureaucracies that lie between children and college. So having a coach, having a mentor, having a small group to work with on this, to reach out to get support, can make a big difference. We have evidence from the City University of New York community colleges that creating sort of wraparound supports for low-income students can double the rate at which they graduate. And this again is about, so in that case, the supports were situated in the college, but they just as easily could be situated in a community, in a nonprofit, in a high school. Basically, you need to be able to give students the supports that other students get from a family that has lots of resources, social, financial resources that help those kids get to and through college.
Yeah, I'm delighted that you use that metaphor. That's one that we frequently use as a rationale for the work in by all means in the Ed Redesign Lab, which is building this sort of cradle to career pipeline that meets children where they are, gives them what they need inside and outside of schools. And frequently in making that argument, we say, think of what those of us who have privilege are able to routinely do for our children from prenatal all the way until they're in their 20s and 30s in order to support them in being successful. that's that's a proof positive that we can do it. We know how to create a platform for everybody to be successful. And we also know what some of the ingredients are. It's not rocket science. We do it. The question is, how do you make a default system for those who aren't lucky enough to happen to be in the lottery of birth born into those resources?
And there's two approaches to this. One is to simplify, to take down the barriers so that students don't need help getting up and over them. So, eliminate the financial aid application. The other tack is, if the application is in place, create supports to help the student do the application, right? Mm-hmm. So from a policy perspective, we can be pushing to dismantle the barriers. Locally, we can be working that while the barriers are in place. The SAT is a good example of this again, right? While the barriers are in place, pretending they're not there doesn't help. Helping students, providing them the institutional resources they need to get over them does.
Yeah. But part of my point is we need to be doing that same kind of wraparound philosophy. All the things that you said an educated, well-resourced parent would do is what creates the pipeline to get people to the front door of college in the first place. So yes. If you don't have that, a lot of kids don't even arrive at that front door to knock on the door.
That's right. So making sure that you take a set of classes in high school that are right. going to make you eligible for a 4-year college.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So, making sure the kid knows you need to take math every year. You need to take English every year. Yes, they're going to let you take less than that in your high school. But if you do, you're not going to be able to apply to the local 4-year school.
We have some questions from colleagues in California. One has to do with, community college enrollment, not just in California, but I think generally is dropping in these times, and wondered if you'd comment about that. And then in particular, about the needs of English language learning students and low income students. What can be done to increase engagement for that group? Because it seemed like, at one level, we're saying older students would do well online, but now online is a modality a lot of these places, and folks are dropping off for that and other reasons. Would you comment about that whole area?
So, when I was talking about older students being more able, it's all compared to a 6-year-old, right? So what I am painfully aware that for many low-income students, getting online for college is difficult. For a 6-year-old, doing it by themselves, it's impossible. Right. So this is, our youngest kids need to have an adult nearby in order to get them online and in school, right? Just practically, it's impossible otherwise. It doesn't matter if you give the 6-year-old a hotspot and a cell phone and a tablet. The 6-year-old can't do all that stuff by themselves. By contrast, if we gave our community colleges sufficient resources so that they could make sure that all of their students have a hotspot and have a computer, that would go a long way towards making the online option viable for disadvantaged students. The first data coming out from the first fall of the pandemic in terms of college attendance is pretty horrifying. So indeed, we have seen a drop nationwide in community college enrollment of 22%. And community colleges are, as I said, the on-ramp to post-secondary school for low-income and disadvantaged students. So this is pretty much a disaster. In general, we'd expect that during a recession, enrollment would go up. So to see it go down 22% is just a total disaster. We're seeing drops in the 4-year colleges as well. They're just smaller. Overall, post-secondary enrollment is down 16% nationwide, and this is going to affect our nation for decades, right? So it's going to increase inequality. So if we were able, the data we've got right now can't focus in on what does that drop in attendance look like by income. But the community college statistic is a pretty good rough guide, because that is, community colleges are disproportionately enrolled disadvantaged students. We're not seeing a big drop in enrollment in the Ivy League, right? It's in the public colleges that we're seeing drops.
Absolutely.
Schools need the resources to make sure that their students can get online, right? So this issue with, Wi-Fi access, broadband access is one that matters from kindergarten through college, right? So a national strategy on broadband access for students is important. Access to technology is important, and then resources they need to actually open safely once the time comes. Protective equipment and better ventilation. These apply all the way from kindergarten through college.
So we've got a couple of questions from the mayor of Oakland, Libby Schaaf, about also obviously coming from California. She focuses some attention on, knowing that more resources from students in the lowest quartile are important, but what about lower middle class students and who sometimes miss some of those thresholds? What do we need to be thinking about with them? And then a second related question. What about, if you move away from the FAFSA, what happens to undocumented students and those who, who don't have the documentation that they're going to need to be eligible for Pell and other financial grants?
Let me work backwards. If you ask me two questions, I'm certain to answer just one of them because
That's okay. I'll remind
out
you.
the brain. So I'll answer the FAFSA one first. The FAFSA relies on tax returns and so forth to qualify students for financial aid. What I've proposed and others have proposed is basically get rid of the middleman, get rid of the FAFSA, and just directly use the tax system. Now, for those who are undocumented, not being documented is a challenge whether we got the FAFSA in place or not. So, but it doesn't make it any worse. Right. So it's not that qualifying students using the tax system would solve all of our problems, but would get rid of a bunch of them.
By the way, while we're on that topic, just one other one that's come up. Who's got the authority to do that? Could you do that by executive order? Or is that going to take a congressional action?
There's a lot that can be done by executive order. So and Obama did a bunch by executive order. So, we have the data retrieval tool. If anybody's filled out a FAFSA recently where the data from the tax system gets dropped automatically into your FAFSA, that's something that was not legislated. That's something that was done by agencies, by just the Department of Education doing its job better. That many of the problems, almost all the problems with the financial aid system are not due to legislative intent, but due to execution by the Department of Education. So the fact that we can now apply for the FAFSA as early as October was an Obama era initiative that I and others had pressed. So you can do a lot without legislation.
Good, thank you. So then there was the lower middle class question.
So that's going to be, the second quartile. Right, is going to be the lower middle class. And what you can see is, yes, they do better than the lowest 25%, but it's, basically it's each step up the income ladder helps. But, much of the increase in BA completion in particular is really concentrated in the top quartile. What we see, the second quartile is better off than the first. 21% getting a BA versus 9%, but they're not up here with the top income quartile at all. So, I've highlighted the difference between the bottom quartile and the top quartile to show how stark these differences are. But as you can see, the top versus the lower middle class, the middle class is quite high as well.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions about programs that students might have participated in during their K-12 years and whether or not these tend to advantage them in terms of college admissions, college completion. And those are early childhood, number one, and a second, career technical education. Do you have any data on that?
We have strong evidence that high quality early childhood education increases later in life, college going and college completion. There's longstanding evidence on that question. We also know that having smaller classes and better teachers in kindergarten makes it more likely that a child will go to college and complete college. So the early investments matter quite a bit. The career and technical education, evidence from Massachusetts and a few other states is that when it's well executed and well funded, it helps a lot as well. That's not my particular area of expertise, but other people who've done good work, and I trust their work, have shown good effects.
Do you like the work of the Federal TRIO and Gear Up programs?
You touched on something here. So we don't have evidence on the efficacy of those programs. So there was a randomized trial on the TRIO programs, on Upward Bound in particular, a number of years ago, and it showed no effect. And I think the problem that we've got in many places is that it's not reaching the right set of students. So what we know right now is that in general, they don't work. There may well be local bright spots where it does work. We know, what I would say for somebody who's running an Upward Bound program, one of the TRIO programs, is basically look to the education literature, the mentoring programs, the after-school programs, the kind of assistance that we've shown works in the schools, and deliver it through an Upward Bound if your own school is not delivering it.
You have in the audience an assemblage of local children's cabinets, groups of people who care about child development and education, including the mayor and the superintendent, leading such efforts, coming together to think about ways that they can build out this pipeline and assure outcomes like more students going to college, more students completing college. If you were, advising groups like that now about the highest leveraged interventions that they could pursue with limited political and economic capital at their disposal, where would you direct them?
That was my intention with the slides at the end of my talk, right? In part, right? So there's the obvious, more money, please, for education. And then there's, given the money we've got, what can we do? If we're thinking about the, and I do a lot of my work on college going and college completion, creating networks of support for low-income students, for disadvantaged students. Tennessee has tested a model in which every, they actually have scaled a model in which every student who is considering going to college has an adult mentor who helps them through the process for the reasons that we've discussed.
Yeah.
That's
We're big fans of that.
Yeah, a tutoring core, right? So I would love to see, we've got, with unemployment as it is, we have a lot of young people who are college students or hope to be college students who don't have jobs, recent college graduates. We've got a huge set of students, young people who could be tapped to serve as mentors and tutors. So I think tapping that group of students and using them to support kids as they're doing their online learning, support kids in going through the process of thinking about college is important. So basically, I would love to see an AmeriCorps initiative that made use of all of these recent graduates who can't get jobs.
Yeah. And there is legislation. I think Senator Coons has legislation in Congress right now, even before the pandemic, to create such a National Youth Service Corps, and we've been strongly supportive of that. If you have the opportunity to give advice, I'm sure you do have the opportunity to give advice to the Biden administration, or will do so even if not asked. What do you think they should focus on for the first 100 days? I mean, you're looking at the whole spectrum, but we've spent a lot of time talking about college going. So I open it back up to the whole spectrum. And do you think they're going too big? I mean, that's one criticism of the administration is they put a lot of big ticket items on the plate, and it may not be possible to get them all at once. It may scare people away. Would you suggest particular priorities for them in moving ahead, or establishing a foothold in the first 100 days? Or where do you come down on all that?
We are in the middle of a historic disaster, the pandemic and the resultant crippling of the economy. This is a Great Depression scale. This is a World War II scale hit on our society. So thinking big is exactly what needs to happen. So thinking in terms of Marshall Plan and the WPA and the other efforts that we made to pull the country out of the Great Depression that's the scale we need to be thinking of. In terms of education, that means federal assistance to states and districts, right? So states cannot solve this. States have to balance their budgets. They can't generate the debt that is needed to stimulate an economy during this kind of downturn. So the feds have to give the monies to the states to fund the schools. So we're seeing already cuts in school funding in K-12 schools, which given the increased needs are a disaster, right? We need an increase in funding. So getting more money to the K-12 schools is, I think, a first order importance. As is getting more money to the public colleges that educate students. So I think we need this is not a time for sort of technocratic solutions. We should do the smart things that have an evidentiary basis with the money, but there is no way to get around the fact that we need enormous amounts of money.
So would you favor a block granting or a categorical granting kind of strategy at the federal level now?
I actually think it's just basically I guess it's block granting because it's a matter of essentially, through the chute of the state funding, getting it down to the localities. Others, Nora Gordon has done some great work over at Brookings about how best to deliver the funds so that it doesn't become subject to the various inequities that are built into the federal funding formulae right now. So others have done work thinking about how best to deliver it. I won't say I'm an expert on Title I, but it's basically, it's not about through narrow individual programs, but it's overall funding capacity for the schools, much as we saw during the Great Recession.
There's a lot of interest in the subject of assessment and accountability, and not only what we ought to be doing in this moment and in coping with this crisis, but in the long term after we've gone through an era where there was a fair amount of testing and a fair amount of pushback about it. One school of thought sees testing as an equity tool, as a way of finding out where the gaps are so that we can target efforts to remediate them. Others see it in some ways as reinforcing inequity. I wonder where you come down on that, both in the immediate moment and where we should be headed in the long term.
The picture that I showed of gaps in test scores, progress made, all of it relies on having done testing. And I come down on prudent amounts of universal testing are important. So we were blind to some of the enormous inequities within states, within districts, in academic achievement. Whether we need it every year in 3 through 8, maybe not. But do we need to continue to have standardized testing? I believe so. I think it's too easy to ignore enormous differences across schools and across groups of students in their outcomes. And they're invaluable for understanding, what's effective, which of our policies are effective in closing those gaps. Some tests are better than others. So it's important to have a test that reflects the values you have as educators. But I think more data is better. I don't like steering in the dark. So I think we need headlights.
Yeah, thank you. As we're moving to the close of our time, again, mindful of a lot of local people here doing good work in local communities, and we have this complex intergovernmental system with local, state, and federal levels. And this group is concerned about both targets for advocacy and targets for local action in dealing with, the symptoms of inequality, as well as advocating against the causes of inequality. What, any other kinds of advice? We've talked a little bit about the college end of things, but any other advice you'd have for local leaders who want to make their mark in terms of pointing a new, more equitable direction for public education in America?
You mean in terms of policies or pressure points?
Yeah, in terms of where they should focus their time and energy and resources and advocacy efforts and so forth at the local. If we're trying to develop local initiatives to sort of set the tone and show the way to a new way of working with young people, and to a set of policies and practices that sort of reinforce and act on the evidence of what's effective in terms of preparing not just some of our children for success, but all of our children for success. What are the most important kinds of actions to be taking locally, do you think?
And to do it with no money, of course, or very little.
That's the problem.
Right. So this is where I come back to tapping the potential of recent college graduates, recent high school graduates, retirees. I mean, the flip side of unemployment being as high as it is that there are a lot of people out there who aren't doing anything and could potentially be available to help with the mentoring, with the tech support. I would love to see that every high school classroom, third grade classroom has, a tech support student in there, an intern, a AmeriCorps type person helping out, right? So find a way to tap volunteers because great thing about a recession is that everybody's time is cheap. So organizing all those people in a way that they can help, I would hope would pay dividends going forward. But pretty much everything else is going to require some money being parachuted in
order to do it. Yeah. Well, I think it's a great suggestion. I mean, the power of building networks is not only important for the sort of substantive technical support that it can provide to people who need it, but also just sort of referring back to the comments I made about relationships earlier, but just restoring relationships in a community where this school closing and all the associated problems and precautions we have to take in this environment have fractured relationships all over the place, and people aren't connected. And so this business of using our local work to build connections between people, not least of which is between people who maybe have differing views of where we need to go or what we're about as a community or as a nation, but starting to open pathways where people can make common cause to work on things that they all agree, the prosperity and well-being of young people is something that pretty much everybody agrees they want to work on. I mean, when you ask the American public, they care about these things, but many of them don't have an outlet. They don't know what to do about it. And if some leader in a community comes up and saying, we're creating our own mentoring corps, we're creating our own tech corps, or one thing or another as you're prescribing, I think that offers, a lot of bright prospects for things that local citizens and local leaders can do. Well, so we're at the end of our time, and I, as predicted, you've given us a ton to think about and presented it in a very thoughtful and provocative way. I want to thank you for being here. We love the fact that you're coming and will be a colleague of ours, and we appreciate the thought. Please, everybody, go off mute and give our keynote speaker the round of applause that she so richly deserves.
I really look forward to working with you in the future. And of course, my heart is in Somerville, so I especially look forward to to engaging with the Somerville folks. But I admire your work and I look forward to being part of it.
Thank you very much. We look forward to that connection with you as well. Okay, folks, we're going to, I want to advise you of the next session, which is from 2 to 3 p.m., a collaborative action to advance racial and economic justice. And we've got a great panel there to discuss a topic in which I know you've all been engaged. And so there are a lot of thoughts about that as we go forward. That will come online at 2 o'clock. And I think that's it. Take a break and we'll see you in a half hour. Thanks for the great questions. It was really a good session.